On February 25, 1593, Pope Clement VIII signed his name to a document that would destroy thousands of lives. The papal bull was called Cecca et Obdurata. In Latin, that means the blind and obdurate. The full title was even more revealing: The Blind and Obdurate Perfidy of the Hebrews. With that signature, Jews were expelled from nearly every territory controlled by the Catholic Church in central Italy. They had 3 months to leave, 3 months to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations, 3 months to pack whatever they could carry, dig up the bones of their ancestors from Jewish cemeteries, and walk away from the only life they had ever known. But here is the part that what makes this story worth understanding. This was not some medieval eruption of religious hatred. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of popular violence. The expulsion of 1593 was the calculated final act in a 40-year campaign. A campaign that had burned books, built walls, and systematically dismantled a community that had lived in Rome since before Christianity even existed. The Jews of Rome were the oldest continuous Jewish community in the Western world. They had been there when Julius Caesar walked the Forum. They had been there when Constantine converted to Christianity. They had been there through the fall of the empire, through the chaos of the medieval period, through the Renaissance. And now, after more than 1,500 years, they were being told that their presence was no longer tolerable. So what changed? Why, after all those centuries of coexistence, did the papacy decide that Jews had to go? The answer involves religious fanaticism, political calculation, economic exploitation, and one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of papal policy. Because just 7 years before that expulsion decree, a different pope had actually invited Jews back. He had told them they were welcome. He had promised them protection. And then he died. And everything changed. This is the story of how it happened. This is the story of what was lost. And this is the story of what the expulsion reveals about the relationship between religious authority and the people it claims the right to govern. To understand the expulsion, you first need to understand what was being destroyed. And that requires going back, way back, to grasp just how deep Jewish roots ran in Roman soil. Jews arrived in Rome as early as the 2nd century BCE, during the period when the Roman Republic was expanding across the Mediterranean. They came as merchants, as diplomats, as prisoners of war. They came seeking opportunity in what was becoming the greatest city in the ancient world. By the time of Julius Caesar, there was already a substantial Jewish community living near the banks of the Tiber River, in a neighborhood that would later be called Trastevere. The Trastevere neighborhood sits on the west bank of the Tiber, across the river from the main center of ancient Rome. It was a working-class district, home to immigrants and laborers, the kind of place where newcomers could find a foothold. Jews established themselves there, built prayer houses, developed the institutions of communal life. Caesar himself granted Jews special privileges. This was not charity. It was pragmatic recognition of their usefulness and their loyalty. Caesar recognized their right to practice their religion, to observe the Sabbath even when it conflicted with civic duties, to maintain their own courts for internal disputes. He exempted them from certain taxes and military service that might conflict with their religious obligations. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the historian Suetonius recorded that Jews mourned at his funeral pyre for several consecutive nights. They remembered who had protected them. They understood that his death might mean the loss of their protector. Under the Roman Empire, the Jewish community grew. The relationship with imperial authority was complicated. There were periods of relative harmony and periods of terrible violence. The Great Jewish Revolt of 66 to 70 CE ended in catastrophe, with Roman legions destroying Jerusalem and burning the temple to the ground. This was the central trauma of Jewish history, a loss so profound that its memory shapes Jewish practice to this day. The Emperor Titus returned from that war with thousands of Jewish captives. These prisoners were forced to build the Colosseum as slave labor, their suffering transformed into Roman entertainment. But the existing Jewish community in Rome survived. They absorbed the refugees and the freed slaves. They maintained their prayers, their customs, their hope. They rebuilt. The Arch of Titus still stands in Rome today, at the eastern entrance to the Roman Forum. It shows Roman soldiers carrying the menorah and other sacred objects from the destroyed temple. The images are carved in stone, a permanent record of Jewish defeat. For 2,000 years, Jews refused to walk under that arch. It was a symbol of their greatest loss, a monument to the destruction of everything they held sacred. But they stayed in Rome. Through the conversion of Constantine, through the collapse of the Western Empire, through the invasions of the Visigoths and Vandals, through the chaos of the medieval period, the Jews of Rome remained. They were not always safe. There were periodic outbursts of violence, restrictions on their economic activities, requirements to wear identifying badges. But they were there. They were allowed to exist. They persisted. By the 15th century, the Jewish community of Rome had developed its own internal governance structure called the Universitas Hebreorum. This was essentially a self-governing body that collected taxes, maintained communal institutions, and represented Jewish interests to the papal authorities. There were synagogues, religious schools, cemeteries. There was a complete social infrastructure. The Jews occupied a specific economic niche. They were primarily involved in money lending, second-hand goods trading, and textile work. Many of these occupations had been forced upon them by Christian restrictions that banned Jews from most professions and from owning land. But within those constraints, they built functioning communities. And Rome was not the only place. Jews lived throughout the territories that came to be known as the Papal States. This was a patchwork of lands in central Italy, stretching from Rome northward through Umbria, the Marches, and parts of Emilia-Romagna. The Pope was not just a religious leader, he was a temporal sovereign, ruling these territories like any other Italian prince. In Bologna, there was a thriving Jewish community. In Ancona, the major Adriatic port, Jews played a crucial role in international trade, particularly commerce with the Ottoman Empire. In smaller cities like Perugia, Spoleto, and Orvieto, there were Jewish populations that had been present for centuries. The relationship between Jews and Christian authorities was complicated. On one hand, church doctrine held that Jews were condemned for rejecting Christ and bore collective guilt for the crucifixion. This theological anti-Judaism was embedded in sermons, religious art, and popular culture. On the other hand, the same theological tradition held that Jews should be preserved as witnesses to the truth of Christianity. Their continued existence in a diminished and subordinate state supposedly demonstrated the consequences of rejecting the Messiah. Their eventual conversion would signal the end of days. This created a strange dynamic. Jews were despised but protected, restricted but tolerated, marginalized but necessary. Pope after pope issued declarations affirming the right of Jews to live in Christian lands as long as they accepted their inferior status. A papal bull from the 12th century called Sicut Judaeus, which means as the Jews, established the basic framework. Jews should not be killed, forcibly baptized, or robbed of their property without due process. They should be protected from mob violence. But they should also accept restrictions on their activities and live in a manner that demonstrated their subordinate position. For centuries, this was the uneasy equilibrium. It was not equality, it was not freedom, but it was survival. And then came the 16th century, and everything began to fall apart. The cataclysm started with a business dispute, and it started in the most unlikely place, not in the halls of the Vatican, not in the chambers of the Inquisition, but in a printing shop in Venice. In the early 1550s, two Christian printers were locked in a fierce commercial rivalry over one of the most lucrative markets of the era: Hebrew books. The Talmud, the vast compendium of rabbinic law and commentary that forms the foundation of traditional Jewish practice, had become a valuable commodity. Jewish communities across Europe needed copies. Printed editions could be sold at significant profit, but the competition between the printers turned vicious. One of them, seeking to destroy his rival's business, made a calculated decision. He denounced the Talmud itself to papal authorities. He claimed that this fundamental text of rabbinic Judaism contained passages that blasphemed Christ and mocked Christianity. The accusation was not new. Christians had been attacking the Talmud for centuries. In 1239, Pope Gregory IX had ordered copies of the Talmud seized and examined. In 1242, 24 cartloads of Jewish books were burned in Paris. The Dominican friar Nicholas Donin, a Jewish convert to Christianity, had compiled a list of allegedly offensive passages that served as the basis for these medieval book burnings. But there was something different about the 1550s. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the religious unity of Western Europe. Martin Luther had challenged papal authority. John Calvin had established a rival Christian center in Geneva. England had broken entirely from Rome. The Catholic Church was reeling, uncertain, defensive. In this atmosphere of crisis, the Church looked for ways to demonstrate its power and its orthodoxy. It needed visible enemies. It needed decisive action. It needed to show that it was still in control. The accusation against the Talmud landed on receptive ears. A committee of 6 cardinals was assembled to investigate. The most influential member was Giovanni Pietro Carafa, a fanatical hardliner who had spent his career hunting heretics and who would soon become Pope himself. Carafa was a founding member of the Roman Inquisition. He believed that the Church was locked in a war against darkness, and that any compromise with error was itself a form of error. The committee examined the Talmud, or rather they examined passages that had been translated and presented to them by hostile witnesses. Few, if any, of the cardinals could read Hebrew or Aramaic. They were dependent on informants, many of them Jewish converts to Christianity who carried their own grievances. The verdict was predetermined. The committee concluded that the Talmud was indeed blasphemous. It contained, they claimed, attacks on Christ and the Virgin Mary. It encouraged hostility toward Christians. It was a danger to Christian souls. Pope Julius III accepted the committee's findings. On September 9, 1553, he ordered the destruction of the Talmud throughout the Papal States. The date was not chosen randomly. September 9, 1553 was Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar. On this day, Jews gathered in their synagogues to pray, to hear the shofar blown, to begin the 10 days of repentance leading to Yom Kippur. And as they gathered, Christian authorities were piling their sacred books in the Campo dei Fiori. The Campo dei Fiori, the Field of Flowers, was a large square in the heart of Rome. During the day, it served as a marketplace. Vendors sold vegetables, meat, and household goods. It was a place of commerce, of daily life, of the ordinary transactions that kept the city functioning. On this day, it became a place of destruction. But soldiers and officials had spent weeks confiscating books from Jewish homes, synagogues, and schools. Families had been forced to surrender volumes that had been in their possession for generations, manuscripts that had been copied by hand, letter by letter, over months and years of painstaking labor. Printed books that represented the cutting edge of technology and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. They were piled in the center of the square, and they were set on fire. The flames rose, the parchment curled and blackened, the ink that had recorded the debates of ancient rabbis, the legal discussions that governed every aspect of Jewish life, the stories and parables and prayers that had been transmitted from generation to generation, all of it turned to ash. Approximately 12,000 copies of the Talmud were destroyed that day in Rome alone. The number is almost impossible to comprehend. Each copy represented hundreds of pages. Each page represented hours of work by scribes or printers. The total loss of text was in the millions of pages. And Rome was only the beginning. The burnings spread to other cities: Venice, Bologna, Ferrara, Ancona. Across Italy, Jewish communities watched as the accumulated wisdom of centuries went up in flames. The scholar Mauro Pirani has spent decades trying to identify fragments of these destroyed texts. He has found roughly 370 sheets and small sections that survived only because some individuals, seeing an opportunity for profit, sold the parchment to bookbinders rather than burning it. That is all that remains. 370 fragments out of 12,000 volumes. The Talmud burning was a declaration of war, but it was only the beginning. 2 years later, in May 1555, Cardinal Carafa achieved his ambition. He was elected Pope Paul IV. He was 79 years old, and he was burning with righteous fury. He had spent his career fighting heresy as an inquisitor. Now he had supreme power, and he intended to use it. Within 2 months of taking office, Paul IV issued the most consequential anti-Jewish document in modern history before the 20th century. On July 14, 1555, he promulgated the papal bull Cum Nimis Absurdum. The title means, "Since it is absurd." The opening lines made the Pope's thinking clear. Since it is absurd and improper that Jews, whose own guilt has consigned them to perpetual servitude, under the pretext that Christian piety receives them and tolerates their presence, should be ingrates to Christians, so that they attempt to exchange the servitude they owe to Christians for dominion over them. The logic was theological, but the consequences were brutally practical. The bull imposed a comprehensive system of restrictions designed to isolate Jews completely from Christian society. First, Jews were ordered to live in a single enclosed quarter with only one entrance and one exit. They had to build a wall around themselves, at their own expense. The gate would be locked every night at sunset and not opened until dawn. This was not imprisonment in the technical sense, but it was confinement. Second, Jews were limited to a single synagogue per city. In Rome, where there had been 7 synagogues serving different communities and liturgical traditions, 6 had to be demolished. The communities were forced to combine into a single cramped space. Third, Jews were required to wear distinctive clothing at all times when outside the ghetto. Men had to wear a pointed yellow hat. Women had to wear a yellow kerchief. The color was significant. Yellow was associated with Judas, the betrayer of Christ. Fourth, Jews were banned from practicing medicine on Christians. They were banned from employing Christian servants. They were banned from eating or drinking with Christians. They were banned from any social relationship that might suggest equality. Fifth, Jews were restricted to the trade of second-hand goods and rag-picking. In Italian, this was called strazzeria. They could buy and sell used clothing, used furniture, junk. That was it. All other economic activities were forbidden. Finally, all prior papal privileges granted to Jewish individuals or communities were revoked. Every exemption, every special permission, every accommodation that had been negotiated over centuries was nullified with a single stroke. The Roman ghetto was established immediately. The area chosen was a small trapezoid of land near the Tiber River, in the low-lying section of the city most prone to flooding. It covered approximately 3 hectares. To put that in perspective, 3 hectares is roughly the size of 4 football fields. This tiny area would eventually house thousands of people. The location was not accidental. This was some of the worst real estate in Rome. The land sat at the lowest point of the city, one where the Tiber regularly overflowed its banks. During floods, which happened several times a year, the streets became rivers of sewage. The standing water bred mosquitoes that carried malaria. The buildings were crumbling, having been neglected for decades. No Christian with options would choose to live there, but Jews no longer had options. The architect Giovanni Salustio Peruzzi was commissioned to build the enclosing wall. Construction began immediately, even before the Jewish inhabitants had time to fully process what was happening to them. The wall was not meant to protect those inside. It was meant to contain them. And here was the cruelest irony. The Jewish community had to pay for it. They had to pay 300 scudi for the construction of their own prison. This was not an insignificant sum. It represented a substantial financial burden for a community that was about to lose most of its economic opportunities. The gates were installed. There would be only one entrance and one exit, later expanded to 3, and finally to 5, under Sixtus V. The gates opened at dawn, signaled by the ringing of church bells. They closed at sunset, signaled by the same bells. Any Jew found outside the ghetto after the gates closed faced severe penalties. Inside the walls, the community had to reorganize its entire existence. There had been 7 synagogues in Rome, serving different communities with different liturgical traditions. Jews of Italian origin, Jews whose ancestors had come from Spain and Portugal, Jews whose families had been in Rome since ancient times. Each had their own customs, their own melodies for prayers, their own ways of doing things. Now 6 of those synagogues had to be demolished. Paul IV permitted only 1. The communities were forced to combine, to share space, to negotiate whose traditions would prevail. The solution they developed was ingenious and heartbreaking. Instead of a single synagogue with a single liturgy, they created the Cinque Skol, the 5 synagogues, housed in a single building. Each congregation occupied different floors or sections, maintaining its own services while sharing walls and a roof with the others. The Tempio, the Nova, the Siciliana, the Catalana, the Castigliana. 5 communities crammed into one structure. The ghetto was filthy, overcrowded, and perpetually at risk of flooding. When the Tiber rose, which it did regularly, the streets became impassable. Cellars flooded. The dead sometimes had to be buried in waterlogged ground. Malaria was endemic. The death rate was higher than in the rest of Rome, and the birth rate struggled to keep pace. Buildings rose 3 and 4 stories higher than normal Roman construction, as families built upward because they could not build outward. These tower-like structures blocked sunlight from the narrow streets below. The alleys became permanently shadowed, damp, unhealthy. Families lived stacked on top of each other, with multiple generations sharing tiny rooms. The smell was inescapable. Thousands of people with inadequate sanitation packed into a space designed for a fraction of that number. The odors of cooking, of laundry, of bodies, of waste, all mingled in the confined air. Christians who passed the ghetto walls often commented on the smell, using it as evidence that Jews were somehow inherently different, inherently dirty. They did not consider that the conditions they had imposed made cleanliness nearly impossible, but they adapted, because that is what Jews had always done. There was one more element of Paul IV's system that deserves attention. The Jews of Rome were compelled to attend conversionist sermons. Every week, they had to leave the ghetto and go to a church, where a priest would preach at them about the errors of Judaism and the truth of Christianity. Attendance was mandatory. Absence was punishable. Contemporary accounts suggest that many Jews stuffed their ears with wax to avoid hearing the sermons. It was a small act of resistance, but it was a resistance nonetheless. Paul IV died in August 1559. The people of Rome celebrated. They attacked the offices of the Inquisition. They tore down his statues. They dragged his coat of arms through the streets. He was hated, and not only by Jews. But the system he created did not die with him. The ghetto remained. The restrictions remained. The machinery of persecution was now built into the structure of papal government. For the next decade, the situation remained roughly stable. The ghetto existed. The restrictions were in place. But successive popes, while not removing the persecution, did not significantly expand it either. There was a kind of grim equilibrium. That ended in 1566, when another hardliner ascended to the papal throne. Pope Pius V was born Antonio Ghislieri in 1504 in a small town in the Duchy of Milan. He entered the Dominican order as a young man and rose through the ranks, not through political connections or family wealth, but through sheer zeal. He was an inquisitor. He hunted heretics. He believed that error had to be exterminated, not tolerated. Before becoming pope, he had served as head of the Roman Inquisition, the institution charged with rooting out Protestant influence and any other deviation from Catholic orthodoxy. He had personally interrogated suspected heretics. He had sent men and women to their deaths for their beliefs. As pope, Pius V brought this inquisitorial mentality to the highest office in the Church. He slept on a bare wooden bed. He wore a hair shirt under his papal vestments, the rough fabric constantly irritating his skin as a form of mortification. He fasted so severely that his health suffered. He believed that the Catholic Church was locked in an apocalyptic struggle against darkness, and that any accommodation to evil was itself evil. Jews, in his view, were a contaminating presence. Their very existence among Christians endangered Christian souls. Their presence was an insult to Christ. Their continued survival was a puzzle that could only be explained by divine forbearance, which would eventually run out. On February 26, 1569, Pius V issued the bull Hebriorum Gens Sola. The title means, "the Jewish people alone." The language was the most extreme that had yet been used in a papal document on Jews. The Jewish people fell from the heights because of their faithlessness and condemned their Redeemer to a shameful death. Their godlessness has assumed such forms that, for the salvation of our own people, it becomes necessary to prevent their disease. Disease, that was the word he used. Not error, not stubbornness. Disease. Jews were not just wrong, they were infectious. They were a plague. They had to be quarantined or eliminated. The bull ordered the total expulsion of Jews from the Papal States, with only 2 exceptions. Jews could remain in Rome itself and in Ancona. Everywhere else, they had 90 days to leave. 90 days to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations. 90 days to settle their affairs, collect their debts, say goodbye to neighbors and friends, and walk away. The logic of the exceptions was coldly practical, revealing the calculations that lurked beneath the theological rhetoric. Rome was the seat of papal authority, the symbolic center of Catholic Christianity. Having Jews there, confined in a ghetto, visible and degraded, served purposes that expulsion would undermine. The ghetto was a living exhibit. Every Christian who passed the walls was reminded of what happened to those who rejected Christ. Every Jew who wore the yellow hat, who was forbidden from riding horses or holding most jobs, who had to endure conversionist sermons, was a walking demonstration of divine punishment. If you expelled all the Jews, you lost this exhibit. You lost the chance to convert them. You lost the theological argument made visible. Ancona was different. Ancona was about money. The port city of Ancona sat on the Adriatic coast, facing east toward the Ottoman Empire. It was the Papal States' gateway to eastern Mediterranean trade. Goods flowed through Ancona from Turkey, from Egypt, from the Levant. And much of that commerce was in Jewish hands. Jewish merchants had networks that spanned the Mediterranean. They had contacts in Constantinople and Salonika, in Alexandria and Tunis. They spoke multiple languages. They had family connections across borders. They could facilitate trade that Christian merchants, with their more limited networks, could not. Ottoman sultans actively preferred doing business with Jews. Partly this was pragmatic. Jews were minorities in both Christian and Muslim lands, making them reliable intermediaries who had no political agenda of their own. Partly it was a matter of shared history. The Ottomans had welcomed Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal, and those refugees had brought skills and capital that benefited the empire. Expelling Jews from Ancona would have meant losing that trade. The commerce would simply have moved to rival ports in Venice or Dubrovnik. The papal treasury would have lost revenue it could not afford to lose, so Ancona was exempted. Theology said Jews should be expelled. Economics said Jews were necessary. Economics won, but only in this one city. The rest of the Papal States saw expulsion. In Bologna, the Jewish community had existed for centuries. They had lived through periods of relative tolerance and periods of intense restriction. They had built synagogues, established cemeteries, created the infrastructure of communal life. Now they had 90 days to dismantle all of it. The departure was traumatic beyond what words can easily convey. The community paid a punitive fine of 40,000 scudi for the privilege of being expelled. This was extortion, having already been condemned to leave. They were forced to pay for the right to do so. But the most striking detail was what they took with them. They carried the bones of their dead. Jewish law requires that bodies be buried, not cremated, and that they be treated with respect until the resurrection. The Jews of Bologna were not willing to leave their ancestors in hostile soil, where the graves might be desecrated, where the cemetery might be destroyed, where the memory of the dead might be erased. So they dug up the bones. They wrapped them carefully. They carried them out of the city, past the walls they had known all their lives, along roads leading to an uncertain future, and they reburied them at a small settlement called Pieve di Cento, outside Papal territory, in land where they hoped the dead could rest in peace. The Jews would not return to Bologna for more than 200 years. When they finally did, it was because Napoleon's armies had arrived, sweeping away the old restrictions in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Approximately 1,000 families were expelled across the Papal States: Bologna, Perugia, Spoleto, Orvieto, Viterbo, Ravenna, and dozens of smaller towns. Communities that had existed for centuries vanished in 90 days. But the expulsion from the Papal States was not the only trauma of this period. In Ancona, one of the two cities where Jews were permitted to remain, something even worse had occurred a decade earlier. Something that would shock Jewish communities across the Mediterranean and provoke the first organized Jewish economic resistance in history. Ancona had become a refuge for conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity in Spain and Portugal, often under the threat of death, but who secretly maintained Jewish practices. These people lived in constant danger. In Spain and Portugal, the Inquisition hunted conversos relentlessly. Anyone suspected of secretly practicing Judaism could be arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake. Some conversos fled to Italy, where previous popes had offered them a strange kind of protection. The Church saw conversos as potential genuine converts who might, with proper encouragement, become sincere Christians. This was theologically convenient. Every converso who became a devout Catholic was a victory for the Church. Everyone who relapsed was a criminal who could be punished. In Ancona, conversos had established a significant community. They traded with the Ottoman Empire, while using family connections to merchants in Constantinople and Salonika who had openly returned to Judaism. They contributed to the city's economy. They lived in an uneasy middle ground, neither fully Christian nor openly Jewish, always vulnerable. Pope Paul IV changed everything. Paul IV did not see conversos as potential converts. He saw them as heretics. A heretic was worse than a Jew. A Jew, in church doctrine, had never accepted Christ and could not be held to Christian standards. A converso, having been baptized, had accepted Christ and then betrayed him. This was apostasy, the worst of sins. In 1555, shortly after issuing Cum Nimis Absurdum and creating the Roman ghetto, Paul IV ordered the arrest of conversos in Ancona. He did not offer them a chance to repent. He did not give them time to flee. He simply ordered them seized. Approximately 100 people were imprisoned. They were held in the dungeons of the Inquisition, where conditions were horrific. Dark, damp, infested with vermin, the cells were designed to break the spirit before the torture even began. And torture there was. The Inquisition had refined its methods over centuries. The rack, the strappado, water torture, burning. The goal was to extract confessions, to force the accused to admit their secret Judaism, to name others who shared their crime. Under torture, people confessed to things they never did. They named names at random, anyone who might satisfy the torturers and end the pain. 50 of the prisoners were put on formal trial. The evidence against them came from their own coerced confessions and from informants who had their own reasons to accuse. The verdicts were predetermined. The Inquisition did not acquit. In May 1556, 25 conversos were led to the Campo dei Fiori, the same square where the Talmud had been burned 3 years earlier. They were tied to stakes. They were given one last chance to repent, to die as Christians rather than as Jews. Some accepted. They received the mercy of strangulation before the flames reached them. Others refused. They died screaming as the fire consumed them, maintaining to the end the faith they had been forbidden to practice. The Ancona martyrs, as they came to be called in Jewish memory, provoked an extraordinary response. Dona Grazia Nasi was one of the wealthiest and most influential Jews in the world. Born into a converso family in Portugal, she had fled across Europe, eventually settling in Constantinople under the protection of the Ottoman Sultan. She was a banker, a philanthropist, a leader of the Sephardic diaspora. She had used her wealth to help other conversos escape, funding an underground network that smuggled refugees to safety. When news of the Ancona burnings reached her, Dona Grazia was outraged. But she was also in a position to do something about it. She organized what may have been the first Jewish economic boycott in history. She called on Jewish merchants across the Mediterranean to stop doing business with Ancona and redirect their trade to the rival port of Pesaro, which was controlled by the Duke of Urbino rather than the Pope. The logic was straightforward. If Ancona depended on Jewish trade, then Jews could use that dependence as leverage, hurt the city's economy, and the Pope might think twice before burning more people. The boycott was not universally supported. Some Jewish communities refused to participate, fearing that it would only make things worse. They argued that provoking the Pope would bring more persecution, not less. They calculated that submission was safer than resistance. Other communities joined enthusiastically. They saw the boycott as a chance to fight back, to demonstrate that Jews were not simply passive victims who could be abused without consequence. The boycott lasted about 8 months. Its success was mixed. Ancona did suffer economically, but not catastrophically. The Pope did not reverse course. More conversos were not burned, but that was probably because there were few left to burn. Most had fled or been killed. But the attempt itself was remarkable. For the first time, Jews had tried to wield economic power as a weapon against persecution. They had organized across borders. They had coordinated action among communities that spoke different languages and followed different customs. They had said, in effect, that cruelty would have costs. The lesson was not lost on future generations. By 1570, the situation for Jews in the Papal States had reached what seemed like rock bottom. They were confined to 2 cities. They were restricted to degrading occupations. They were compelled to attend conversionist sermons. They were surrounded by walls that they themselves had paid to build. And yet, conversion rates remained remarkably low. Despite all the pressure, despite all the sermons, despite all the restrictions designed to make Jewish life so miserable that baptism would seem like a relief, very few Jews actually converted. Scholars estimate that between the creation of the ghetto and the end of the 17th century, perhaps 1,195 Jews converted in Rome. That works out to roughly 2 per 1,000 of the population per year. The system was brutal, but it was failing at its stated purpose. And then, something unexpected happened. After decades of escalating persecution, a new pope came to power who actually seemed to want things to be different. His motivations were not noble, but for the Jews who benefited, motivation mattered less than results. Pope Sixtus V was elected in April 1585. His birth name was Felice Peretti. He came from a poor family in the Marches region of central Italy, and he had risen through the church hierarchy through sheer determination and political skill. But he was a Franciscan friar with a reputation for both brilliance and brutality. Like his predecessors, Sixtus V was a hard man, perhaps the hardest. Within months of taking office, he launched a campaign against banditry that filled the roads of the Papal States with corpses. Bandits were hunted down and killed. Criminals were executed publicly, their bodies displayed as warnings. The crime rate plummeted. Rome became safer than it had been in generations. But the cost was enormous. Sixtus V's justice was swift, certain, and merciless. He executed not just bandits, but their families, their associates, anyone connected to them. He believed that terror was the only language that criminals understood, and he spoke it fluently. This was the man who decided to reverse papal policy toward Jews. Why? Not because he was particularly sympathetic to them. Sixtus V shared the conventional prejudices of his era. He believed Jews were in error, that they should convert, that their continued existence was a theological puzzle. But he also understood something that his predecessors had ignored or suppressed. Jews were useful. They had skills that Christians lacked. They had commercial networks that could generate revenue. They were willing to engage in activities, particularly money lending, that Christian doctrine supposedly forbade. In a Europe increasingly driven by commerce, you needed people who could move money. The Papal States needed money desperately. Sixtus V had enormous ambitions. He wanted to rebuild Rome, to complete St. Peter's Basilica, to construct obelisks and fountains and monuments that would make the city worthy of being the capital of Christendom. All of this required capital, and Jews could provide capital. On October 22, 1586, Sixtus V issued a document called Christiana Pietas. The title means Christian Piety. The content was revolutionary. The bull effectively reversed everything that Paul IV and Pius V had done. It permitted Jews to return to all cities and territories of the Papal States, not just Rome and Ancona. It allowed them to practice medicine again, treating Christian patients. It permitted them to engage in any form of commerce and industry, not just the degraded trades they had been restricted to. It authorized the establishment of synagogues, schools, and cemeteries wherever Jews settled. Christiana Pietas explicitly revoked the previous bulls of Paul IV and Pius V to the extent that they conflicted with these new permissions. The compulsory conversionist sermons, which had required Jews to sit every week listening to priests explain why they were wrong, were reduced to 6 times per year. The ghetto gates in Rome were expanded from 3 to 5, making movement in and out somewhat easier. Banking licenses were issued to Jewish financiers, allowing them to lend money legally and profitably. This was not tolerance in the modern sense. The ghetto remained. The yellow hats remained. The fundamental inequality of Jews and Christians remained. But within those constraints, Jewish life became significantly more bearable. Jews began to return. Communities that had been destroyed in 1569 started to rebuild. In Bologna and across Umbria, families came back to the places their parents and grandparents had been forced to abandon. They reopened businesses. They reestablished prayer houses. They dared to hope. There is a remarkable document from this period that illustrates how thoroughly pragmatism had replaced theology at the highest levels of papal government. A Jewish entrepreneur named Magino de Gabriel of Venice received from Sixtus V a 60-year exclusive patent on a new glassmaking process. The Pope's own sister, Camilla Peretti, took a financial stake in the venture, receiving half of Magino's profits. Think about what this meant. The Pope's sister was in business partnership with a Jew. The Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church had approved an arrangement in which his own family profited from Jewish enterprise. This was not tolerance born of moral conviction. It was tolerance born of greed. But it was tolerance nonetheless. The communities that rebuilt during Sixtus V's pontificate allowed themselves to believe that the worst was over. They had survived Paul IV. They had survived Pius V. They had been expelled, and they had returned. Perhaps the persecutions had been an aberration. Perhaps the Church had learned that coexistence was possible, even necessary. Sixtus V died in August 1590. He was 70 years old, and his health had been failing for months. His death opened a period of extraordinary instability at the top of the Church. In the next 17 months, 3 popes held office in rapid succession. Urban VII was elected and died after only 12 days, before he could even be crowned. Gregory XIV lasted 10 months, accomplishing little. Innocent IX survived only 2 months. Each election was contentious. Each pontificate was too brief to establish any coherent policy. During this chaos, the gains Jews had made under Sixtus V remained in place. The returning communities continued to grow. The situation seemed cautiously stable. And then, on January 30th, 1592, the College of Cardinals elected a new pope. His name was Ippolito Aldobrandini. He took the name Clement VIII. And everything fell apart. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Clement VIII was and what pressures he faced. Because the expulsion of 1593 was not the act of a monster. It was the act of a man who believed he was serving God. And understanding how sincere conviction can produce terrible outcomes is essential to understanding how persecution works. Ippolito Aldobrandini was born on February 24, 1536, in the coastal town of Fano, in the Marches region of central Italy. His family was originally Florentine, wealthy, and well-connected to the world of papal politics. His father, Silvestro Aldobrandini, was a prominent jurist who served multiple popes in the various legal capacities. Young Ippolito was raised to succeed. He studied law at the finest universities of Italy, Padua, Perugia, Bologna. He mastered canon law, the legal system of the Church, and civil law, the inheritance of Roman jurisprudence. He became expert at navigating the complex intersection of spiritual authority and temporal power that defined papal government. He did not become a priest until he was approximately 44 years old, relatively late by the standards of the time. But many high-ranking churchmen entered religious life young, rising through the hierarchy over decades. Aldobrandini came to the priesthood as a mature man, already formed in character and conviction. His spiritual mentor was Philip Neri, a priest whose warmth and humanity would later earn him canonization as a saint. Neri founded the Congregation of the Oratory, a religious community emphasizing prayer, charity, and pastoral care. He was known for his gentleness, his sense of humor, his accessibility to the poor and marginalized. The influence of Neri on Aldobrandini was profound. He emerged from that relationship as a man of genuine, intense piety. He prayed for hours daily. He fasted regularly. He took seriously the spiritual responsibilities of his office in a way that many Renaissance churchmen did not. But he was also a lawyer and a politician. These were not separate from his piety. They were expressions of it. He believed that good governance was a form of worship, that justice, properly administered, served God as surely as prayer. In 1585, Pope Sixtus V made Aldobrandini a cardinal. It was recognition of his administrative abilities and his orthodox reputation. More significantly, Sixtus sent him as papal legate to Poland, where a succession crisis threatened to destabilize one of the largest Catholic kingdoms in Europe. Aldobrandini succeeded. He mediated between competing factions. He brokered a compromise that preserved the peace. He demonstrated diplomatic skills that marked him as a man capable of handling the most complex challenges. His success in Poland earned him gratitude from the Habsburg dynasty, which had its own interests in Polish stability. It established his reputation as someone who could get things done, and it positioned him for the ultimate prize. The conclave that elected him in 1592 was one of the most contentious in generations. The College of Cardinals was split into factions, each backed by one of the great powers. The Spanish faction, supported by King Philip II, backed Cardinal Giulio Antonio Santori. Santori was the Grand Inquisitor, the head of the Roman Inquisition, a man whose entire career had been devoted to hunting heretics and enforcing orthodoxy. He was brilliant, ruthless, and deeply feared. His election would have meant a papacy entirely defined by the Inquisition's priorities. The French faction opposed Santori, but could not agree on an alternative. France was emerging from decades of religious civil war, and its influence in papal elections was weaker than Spain's. The French wanted to block Santori more than they wanted to elect anyone specific. The deadlock lasted for weeks. Cardinals maneuvered and intrigued. Outside powers applied pressure. The conclave threatened to drag on indefinitely. Aldobrandini emerged as a compromise. He was acceptable to the Spanish because of his conservative theology and his reputation for orthodoxy. He was acceptable to the French because he was not Santori, and critically, he was acceptable to Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici of Tuscany, who helped engineer the final votes. On January 30th, 1592, Ippolito Aldobrandini became Pope Clement VIII. He was 55 years old. His pontificate would last 13 years, until his death in March 1605. In that time, he would accomplish much that historians remember positively. His greatest diplomatic achievement came in 1595, when he absolved King Henry IV of France, ending decades of religious warfare and allowing the Catholic Church to reconcile with a monarch who had converted from Protestantism to secure his throne. He incorporated the Duchy of Ferrara into the Papal States in 1598 after the ruling Este dynasty died out, a significant territorial expansion. He oversaw the Jubilee of 1600, which attracted an estimated 3 million pilgrims to Rome and generated enormous revenue. He published a corrected version of the Latin Bible known as the Clementine Vulgate. But Clement VIII also had a darker side, one that revealed itself in his treatment of dissenters and outsiders. He personally participated in the heresy trial of Giordano Bruno, the philosopher and former Dominican friar who had developed unorthodox cosmological theories. Bruno proposed that the universe was infinite, that it contained multiple worlds, that the stars were distant suns. These ideas challenged the geocentric cosmology that the Church endorsed. Bruno was held by the Inquisition for 8 years. He was interrogated repeatedly. He was offered chances to recant, which he refused. Finally, on February 17, 1600, he was led to the Campo dei Fiori, the same square where the Talmud had been burned, the same square where the Ancona conversos had died. A gag was placed in his mouth so he could not speak. He was tied to a stake, and he was burned alive. Clement VIII approved this execution. He believed Bruno was a heretic whose ideas endangered souls. He believed that killing Bruno's body to save others' souls was an act of mercy. This was the man who signed the expulsion decree for the Jews, a man of genuine piety, a skilled diplomat, an effective administrator, and someone capable of watching a person burn to death because theological disagreement demanded it. The bull Caeca et Obdurata was dated February 25, 1593, 1 year and 26 days after Clement VIII took office. It was publicly posted on the doors of the basilicas of St. Peter and St. John Lateran on March 13th, ensuring that all Rome would know the papal decree. The document survives. Physical copies exist in archives and have occasionally appeared at auction. In 2016, Sotheby's sold an original copy, a single bifolio of 4 pages with large papal arms on the first page, estimated at $4,000 to $6,000. It is a beautiful object in its way. Elegant calligraphy, impressive seals, all the apparatus of power made material, and the content is devastating. The document began with a theological justification that echoed the bulls of Paul IV and Pius V. Jews, it claimed, had rejected the Messiah and were therefore condemned by their own actions. They had crucified Christ. They had refused the salvation offered to them. Their continued existence in their current state was an aberration that required correction. Christian piety, the bull continued, had tolerated Jewish presence in the hope that they might eventually see the light. This was the traditional Augustine doctrine. Jews were preserved as witnesses, as living evidence of the prophecies fulfilled by Christ, as potential future converts whose ultimate acceptance of Christianity would signal the end of days. But instead of gratitude, Clement VIII claimed Jews had shown only obstinacy. They had taken advantage of the kindness of previous popes, particularly Sixtus V, to expand their presence and their influence. They had spread beyond the ghettos where they belonged. They had engaged in commerce beyond the degraded trades permitted them. They had infected Christian society with their presence. Therefore, Clement VIII decreed that Jews must be expelled from all territories of the Papal States, except for 3 locations: Rome, Ancona, and the Comtat Venaissin, the papal enclave around Avignon in southern France. The Jews of Bologna, who had returned hopefully after 1586, had now had to leave again. The Jews of Perugia, of Spoleto, of Orvieto, of all the towns and cities across Umbria and the Marches and the Romagna where they had rebuilt their lives, all of them had to go. They had 3 months to undo 7 years of rebuilding. The bull specifically revoked Sixtus V's Christiana Pietas. Every permission that had been granted was now withdrawn. Every synagogue that had been reopened had to close. Every business that had been reestablished had to be abandoned. The clock was reset to 1569, as if the 7 years of tolerance had never happened. For those permitted to remain in Rome, Ancona, and Avignon, conditions were tightened rather than loosened. Mandatory conversionist sermons were reinstated at their previous weekly frequency. The relaxation of ghetto regulations was reversed. All the restrictions of cum nimis absurdum that Sixtus V had softened were reimposed in full force. 3 days later, on February 28, 1593, Clement VIII issued a companion bull called Quum Hebraeorum Militia. The title means, "Since the wickedness of the Hebrews." This document ordered the burning of the Talmud and all related commentaries, treatises, and Kabbalistic texts. Owners of such books had 10 days to surrender them to the Roman Inquisition if they were in Rome, and 2 months to hand them over to local inquisitors elsewhere in the Papal States. The penalty for keeping forbidden books was severe. The burnings were carried out. The cycle that had begun in 1553 continued. On January 14, 1601, Talmud copies were publicly destroyed again in Rome. The fires had not stopped burning. And yet, even as he was ordering expulsions and book burnings, Clement VIII demonstrated the economic pragmatism that coexisted uneasily with theological conviction. On March 8, 1593, barely 2 weeks after signing the expulsion decree, he issued a separate bull granting commercial privileges to Turkish Jewish merchants. Ottoman Jews could come to Ancona to trade. They could stay for defined periods. They could conduct business necessary for the papal treasury. Theology demanded that Jews be expelled. Economics demanded that some Jews be permitted. The contradiction was resolved by distinguishing between Jews who lived permanently under papal authority and Jews who visited temporarily for commercial purposes. Near the end of his pontificate, in August 1604, Clement VIII issued yet another bull, this one favoring Portuguese Marranos, the descendants of forcibly converted Jews who had fled Portugal. He needed their financial expertise. The same pope who had expelled Jews and burned their books was willing to accommodate different Jews when money was at stake. So the question becomes unavoidable. If Clement VIII was willing to make exceptions for economic reasons, was the expulsion really about religion, or was it about something more complicated? The truth is that no single factor explains the expulsion of 1593. It was the product of multiple forces converging at a specific historical moment. The first force was institutional. The Council of Trent had concluded in 1563, setting the agenda for what historians call the Counter-Reformation, or Catholic Reformation. The council itself did not directly address Jewish policy in its formal decrees. Those focused on countering Protestant theology and reforming internal church abuses. But the council created an atmosphere of intensified vigilance against all forms of deviation from orthodoxy. The Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, had originally targeted Protestants. By the 1590s, its scope had expanded dramatically. It oversaw censorship through the Index of Forbidden Books. It prosecuted conversos suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. It monitored the boundaries between Jewish and Christian communities. Although it technically lacked jurisdiction over professing Jews, it could intervene in numerous ways. And its leadership was dominated by hardliners who viewed Jewish presence as fundamentally incompatible with a properly ordered Catholic society. The second force was factional politics within the papal court. Cardinal Giulio Antonio Santori, who had lost the papal election to Clement VIII in 1592, remained a powerful figure as Grand Inquisitor. Santori was a fanatical opponent of Jewish presence. His autobiography and diaries, studied by the scholar Saverio Ricci, reveal a man utterly convinced that Jews were a spiritual danger that had to be eliminated. Clement VIII actually regarded Santori as dangerous and took the unprecedented step of personally attending Inquisition meetings to assert papal authority over the institution. They were rivals, but on Jewish policy they were aligned. Clement VIII may have acted partly to preempt criticism from the hardliners, demonstrating his own zeal before they could accuse him of laxity. The third force was economic. This seems paradoxical. Since Jewish economic activity was precisely what had motivated Sixtus V's tolerance. But Clement VIII faced pressure from Christian merchants and moneylenders who resented Jewish competition. With Jews restricted to a few degraded occupations, they inevitably became specialists in those fields. Christian rivals wanted them gone. Moreover, the papal treasury no longer needed Jewish financiers as desperately as it once had. The incorporation of Ferrara in 1598 brought new revenues. The Jubilee of 1600 was immensely profitable. The calculus that had once made Jewish tolerance economically rational had shifted. The fourth force was the ideology of the Counter-Reformation itself. Catholic reformers in the late 16th century were obsessed with boundaries. The boundaries between Catholic and Protestant. Of the boundaries between Orthodox and heterodox. The boundaries between Christian and non-Christian. A tolerant, permeable society where Jews lived freely among Christians was, in this view, inherently disordered. The ghetto was not just a prison. It was a theological statement. Jews existed, the logic went, as living testimony to the consequences of rejecting Christ. But they had to exist in a state of visible degradation. If Jews lived comfortably, if they prospered, if they interacted freely with Christians, the theological lesson was lost. Worse, Christians might be tempted to doubt whether rejection of Christ was really so catastrophic after all. From this perspective, Sixtus V's tolerance was not merely a policy disagreement, it was a theological error that had to be corrected. The fifth force was personal. Clement VIII was a man of deep and genuine religious conviction. He fasted regularly. He prayed for hours. He took his spiritual responsibilities with deadly seriousness. And he believed, sincerely believed, that Jews were lost souls who might be saved through conversion, and that his duty as Pope required him to maximize the pressure on them to convert. This was not cynical. It was not merely political. Clement VIII thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he was serving God. What did it actually mean for the people affected? The documentation is fragmentary. Unlike the Holocaust, which generated vast archives of bureaucratic records and survivor testimonies, the expulsion of 1593 left only scattered traces. We know more about the policies than about the people who suffered under them. But we can reconstruct something of the experience. In Bologna, the expulsion meant abandoning a community that had existed for centuries. Approximately 900 Jews lived there in 1593. They had 3 months to settle their affairs, collect their debts, and leave. Many headed for Tuscany. Just months after Clement VIII issued his expulsion decree, Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici issued a remarkable document known as the Livornina, a charter specifically designed to attract Jewish merchants to the new free port of Livorno. The timing was not coincidental. Ferdinando saw an opportunity to benefit from papal cruelty. The Livornina was extraordinary for its era, a beacon of relative tolerance in a world growing darker for Jews. It guaranteed freedom of religious practice without interference. It promised no ghetto, no walls, or no curfews. Jews in Livorno could live wherever they could afford to live. They could own property. They could engage in any profession or business. They could build synagogues openly. Perhaps most remarkably, the Livornina offered amnesty from the Inquisition for conversos who wanted to return to Judaism openly. This was radical. The Inquisition claimed jurisdiction over conversos anywhere in Catholic Europe. A converso who had been baptized, even under duress, was considered a Christian forever. To practice Judaism after baptism was heresy, punishable by death. Ferdinando de' Medici essentially told the Inquisition that its writ did not run in his territory. Conversos who came to Livorno could throw off their Christian disguises and live as Jews without fear. This was not merely tolerance. It was defiance of papal and inquisitorial authority. Why did Ferdinando do this? Not out of any particular love for Jews. He wanted their skills, their capital, their commercial networks. Livorno was a new port recently constructed, competing with established cities like Genoa and Venice for Mediterranean trade. Jewish merchants, with their connections across the Mediterranean and beyond, could give Livorno a competitive advantage. The Pope's loss was the Duke's gain. And gain. He did. Jews streamed into Livorno. The community grew with remarkable speed. In 1601, just a few years after the charter, there were 134 Jews in Livorno. By 1622, there were 711. By 1645, there were 1,250. By the end of the century, the community had grown to approximately 2,400. This was explosive growth, a community roughly doubling every 20 years. What the papacy destroyed, the Medici harvested. The merchants driven from Bologna, from Umbria, from all the papal territories brought their expertise, their connections, their energy to Livorno. They helped build the port into one of the most important commercial centers of the Mediterranean. They traded with North Africa, with the Levant, with the Ottoman Empire, with the Atlantic world. The Livorno Jewish community became famous for its prosperity and its culture. Synagogues were built openly, without the cramped secrecy of the ghettos. Jewish schools flourished. Hebrew printing resumed. The community developed its own traditions and institutions, becoming a center of Sephardic life in Italy. Others went to Mantua, where the Gonzaga dukes had a long history of relative tolerance toward Jews. Why the Gonzaga needed Jewish bankers and merchants. They were willing to tolerate Jewish presence in exchange for the economic benefits that presence brought. Some went to Venice, which had its own ghetto but at least permitted Jewish residents. The Venetian ghetto was restrictive, but it was stable. The Republic of Venice valued commerce over theology. It would not exterminate Jews or expel them, because Jews were useful. This cold pragmatism was not kindness, but it was survival. Some went to the small Tuscan town of Pitigliano, perched on a volcanic plateau in southern Tuscany. The town had a significant Jewish community relative to its size, and over time it came to be called Little Jerusalem because of the prominence of Jewish life there. The community survived there for centuries, maintaining synagogues, a kosher bakery, or a ritual bath, all the infrastructure of Jewish communal existence. And some simply moved a short distance to territories adjacent to the Papal States, but not under papal control. The jurisdictional patchwork of Italian politics meant that a few miles could make the difference between expulsion and survival. A family living in Papal Bologna had to leave. A family living in the Duchy of Modena, just kilometers away, could stay. This patchwork nature of Italian political geography would shape Jewish life for centuries. Jews moved constantly between territories, seeking better conditions, fleeing worse ones. They developed expertise in navigating between jurisdictions, in understanding which rulers were relatively tolerant and which were dangerous. For those who remained in Rome, conditions grew worse rather than better. The population of the ghetto increased as Jews from expelled territories sought refuge in the one place they were still permitted to live. 3 hectares of flood-prone land now held even more people than before. The community was organized into 5 liturgical congregations, the Cinque Skol, each maintaining its own traditions. But all were crammed into the same walled enclosure. All were subject to the same restrictions. All had to wear the yellow hat or kerchief when they ventured outside. All had to attend the hated conversionist sermons. The Jewish community of Rome was required to pay 1,100 scudi per year to fund the Casa dei Catecumeni, the House of Catechumens. This was an institution established in 1543 specifically to house Jews who were preparing for baptism. The community that refused conversion was forced to finance the infrastructure of conversion. The Casa dei Catechumeni also became an instrument of abduction. If a Christian servant or acquaintance claimed that a Jewish child had expressed interest in Christianity, that child could be seized and taken to the casa, where they would be held and indoctrinated. Parents who tried to recover their children faced enormous obstacles. The rite of baptism, once performed, was considered indelible. A baptized Jew could never return to Judaism, at least not in the eyes of the Church. The scholar Marina Cafiero has documented these cases extensively. As late as 1784, 60 Jewish children were imprisoned because 2 children were being hidden from officers of the Casa dei Neofiti, the successor institution. The practice of seizing Jewish children for conversion continued for centuries. The exceptions reveal as much as the rule. Why were Rome, Ancona, and Avignon permitted to retain their Jewish populations when everywhere else Jews were expelled? Rome was the symbolic center of Catholic Christianity. Having Jews there, visible and confined, served theological purposes that expulsion would undermine. The ghetto was a living exhibit of Jewish degradation. Every Christian who passed the walls was reminded of what happened to those who rejected Christ. Every Jew who wore the yellow hat was a walking demonstration of divine punishment. Moreover, the conversion project required subjects. If all Jews were expelled, there would be no Jews to convert. The machinery of conversionist preaching, the Casa dei Catechumeni, the entire apparatus designed to bring Jews to baptism, would have no raw material. From the Church's perspective, a small, controlled, perpetually harassed Jewish population was more useful than no Jewish population at all. Ancona was different. Ancona was money. The port city was the Papal States' gateway to Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean trade. Commerce with the Ottoman Empire flowed through Ancona, and much of that commerce was in Jewish hands. Ottoman sultans actively preferred doing business with Jews, partly because of shared enmity toward Christian Europe, partly because Jewish merchants had commercial networks that spanned the Mediterranean. Expelling Jews from Ancona would have been economic suicide. The trade would simply have moved to rival ports. The papal treasury would have lost revenue it could not afford to lose. But so Ancona was exempted. Jews could stay, confined to their ghetto, restricted in their activities, but permitted to continue the trade that filled papal coffers. The Comtat Venaissin, the papal enclave around Avignon in southern France, followed similar logic. It was geographically distant from Rome, and its Jewish community centered in Carpentras. Cavaillon and L'Isle-sur-la-Sorgue played economic roles that the local population could not easily replace. The pattern was consistent. Where Jews were economically indispensable, they were tolerated. Where they were dispensable, they were expelled. Theology provided the justification. Economics determined the application. The expulsion of 1593 was not an isolated event. It fit within a centuries-long European pattern of Jewish expulsions. England had expelled its Jews in 1290, but France had expelled them in 1306, and again, permanently, in 1394. Spain had expelled them in 1492, in what remains the most famous and consequential expulsion in Jewish history. Portugal had forced mass conversion in 1497. Naples had expelled its Jews in 1541. The historian Salo Baron observed that all the regions expelling Jews were evolving national states that defined their identity, partly by eliminating the most visible other. Jews were convenient targets, both economically exploitable and religiously contemptible. But the Papal States were distinctive. The sovereign was simultaneously a religious and temporal ruler. The expulsion carried unique theological weight. It was not just a king saying Jews were unwelcome. It was the vicar of Christ on earth declaring that Jewish presence was incompatible with Christian order. Furthermore, the papal pattern was different from the national pattern. England expelled its Jews once and did not permit their return until 1656. Spain expelled its Jews once and did not formally revoke the expulsion until 1968. But the popes oscillated. Expulsion in 1569. Tolerance in 1586, expulsion again in 1593. This suggests that papal policy toward Jews was not driven by the kind of categorical ethnic nationalism that motivated England or Spain. It was driven by shifting theological currents, factional politics within the papal court, and cold economic calculation. Different popes had different priorities. What one pope did, the next might undo. What the next might undo, the one after might restore. For the Jews caught in this oscillation, the unpredictability was its own form of torture. You could never be sure whether the relative tolerance of today would last until tomorrow. You could never fully rebuild because you never knew when you might be expelled again. The comparison with Venice is instructive. Venice created the world's first ghetto in 1516, giving us the word itself. Ghetto derives from the Venetian dialect word for the foundry district where Jews were confined. But Venice was motivated by commercial pragmatism, not counter-Reformation zeal. The Republic saw Jewish merchants as valuable economic actors who needed to be controlled but not eliminated. Venice never expelled its Jews. The ghetto was degrading. The restrictions were severe, but it was stable. Jews in Venice could plan for the future in ways that Jews in the Papal States could not. The Ottoman Empire offered an even starker contrast. When Spain expelled its Jews in 1492, Sultan Bayezid II actively welcomed them. He allegedly remarked that Ferdinand of Aragon was impoverishing his own kingdom while enriching Turkey. Jewish refugees from Spain transformed Constantinople, Salonika, and other Ottoman cities, bringing skills, capital, and commercial networks that benefited the empire for centuries. In 1556, when Paul IV was burning conversos at the stake in Ancona, Suleiman the Magnificent wrote personally to the Pope demanding the release of those who were Ottoman subjects. The Sultan, a Muslim ruler, was protecting Jews from the Christian vicar of Christ. These comparisons illuminate what was distinctive about papal policy. It was not universal. It was not inevitable. Other Christian rulers, other political systems, or other ideological frameworks produced different outcomes. The expulsion of 1593 was a choice made by particular men under particular circumstances, for particular reasons. For the Jews who remained in Rome after 1593, life continued in the narrow confines of the ghetto. But continued is perhaps too neutral a word. Life went on, but under conditions designed to make it as difficult as possible without quite extinguishing it entirely. The Cinque Skol maintained their liturgies. Every Sabbath, every holiday, the congregations gathered in their cramped spaces to pray the prayers their ancestors had prayed. The melodies of the Tempio differed from those of the Siciliana. The customs of the Catalana differed from those of the Castellana, but all of them faced east, toward Jerusalem, and recited the same ancient texts. While merchants continued their degraded trades, the strazeria, the second-hand goods business, became the defining occupation of Roman Jews. They bought old clothes, old furniture, old everything. They mended and resold what Christians no longer wanted. It was humble work, but it was survival. Families continued to marry, to have children, to die and be buried in Jewish cemeteries that they themselves had to maintain. The cycle of life persisted within the walls. Babies were circumcised on the 8th day. Boys celebrated their bar mitzvah at 13. Couples stood under the chuppah and broke a glass in memory of the destroyed temple. The dead were washed and buried according to ancient customs, but every moment was shadowed by the reality of confinement and the threat of worse. The community developed its own internal culture, its own patterns of adaptation and resistance. Hebrew printing, once a major Jewish activity in Italy, largely migrated to Venice and Amsterdam, where conditions were more conducive to scholarship. But manuscripts were still copied by hand in Rome. Scholarship continued in the oral tradition, teachers transmitting knowledge to students in the time-honored way. The Roman Jewish community developed its own distinctive liturgy, known as the Nusach Italki, or Italian Rite. It combined elements from ancient Palestinian traditions with influences absorbed over centuries of Italian residents. The melodies, the specific prayers, the order of the service, all were slightly different from what Jews practiced elsewhere. It was a local tradition, rooted in a specific place and history. They developed their own culinary traditions as well. Carciofi alla Judia, artichokes Jewish style, deep-fried until crispy. This dish persists in Rome's restaurants today, a culinary inheritance from the ghetto. The constraints of poverty and the limitations of kosher dietary laws combined to produce a distinctive cuisine that survived long after the walls came down. They developed their own dialect, Judeo-Romanesco, mixing Italian and Hebrew with traces of other languages. It was a marker of identity, a way of speaking that distinguished Jews from their neighbors, even when they were outside the ghetto. Language is community. This dialect bound them together. Every year, the chief rabbi of Rome was required to perform a ritual of humiliation that demonstrated the community's subordinate status. He would go to the Campidoglio, the Capitoline Hill that had been the political and religious center of ancient Rome. There, in the palazzo that served as Rome's city hall, he would appear before the city councilors. He would present a copy of the Torah, the sacred scroll containing the 5 books of Moses. A Christian official would take the scroll and examine it. Then he would throw it to the ground or hand it back with a contemptuous gesture, often including a ritual kick or blow to the rabbi himself. In exchange for this degradation, the rabbi received permission for the Jewish community to continue living in Rome for another year. This ceremony continued until the 19th century, every year for more than 200 years after the expulsion of 1593. The highest religious authority of the Roman Jewish community had to submit to public humiliation as the price of survival. The conversionist pressure never relented. Jews were required to attend sermons designed to undermine their faith. They were required to listen quietly while preachers explained why everything they believed was wrong. They could not argue back. They could not leave. They could only sit and endure. Contemporary accounts suggest that many Jews stuffed their ears with wax to avoid actually hearing the sermons. It was a small act of resistance, invisible to the authorities, allowing them to fulfill the letter of the requirement while evading its spirit. The body was present. The mind was elsewhere. They were required to fund the institutions that sought to convert their children. The Casa dei Catecumeni, the House of Catechumens, received 1,100 scudi annually from the Jewish community. This was a substantial sum, a significant portion of the community's collective resources, and it went to pay for an institution whose entire purpose was to transform Jews into Christians. The Casa dei Catecumeni also became an instrument of abduction. The law held that anyone who expressed a desire to convert should be removed to the casa for instruction. This seems reasonable on its face, but in practice, it became a weapon. If a Christian servant, a business rival, a malicious neighbor claimed that a Jewish child had expressed interest in Christianity, that child could be seized. The procedure was devastating for families. A child might be taken on the word of a servant who had a grievance. The parents had almost no recourse. If the child was kept at the casa long enough to be baptized, the transformation was considered complete and irrevocable. Canon law held that baptism, once validly administered, created an indelible spiritual mark. A baptized person was a Christian forever, regardless of their own wishes or their parents' objections. The scholar Marina Cafiero has documented these cases in heartbreaking detail. parents desperately trying to recover their children, children confused and frightened in an unfamiliar institution, the legal machinery of the church grinding forward, indifferent to the human cost. As late as 1784, 60 Jewish children were imprisoned because 2 children were being hidden from officers of the Casa de Neofiti, the successor institution. The practice of seizing Jewish children for conversion continued for centuries, a constant terror hanging over every family. And yet the community survived. More than that, it maintained its identity. The conversion rate remained remarkably low. Despite all the pressure, despite all the sermons, despite all the restrictions designed to make Jewish life so miserable that baptism would seem like a relief, very few Jews actually converted. Scholars estimate that between the creation of the ghetto and the end of the 17th century, perhaps 1,195 Jews converted in Rome. That works out to roughly 2 per 1,000 of the population per year, less than 1/2 of 1% annually. In an environment specifically designed to maximize conversion pressure, almost no one converted. This was not passive survival. It was active resistance. Clement VIII died on March 3, 1605. He was succeeded by Pope Leo XI, who survived only 26 days, and then by Pope Paul V, who reigned until 1621. Neither successor reversed the expulsion. Neither returned Jews to the territories from which they had been expelled. Neither dismantled the ghetto system. The policies of 1593 remained in force, not just for years, not just for decades, but for centuries. The Roman ghetto was not abolished until the unification of Italy. When French revolutionary forces arrived in Rome in 1798, they briefly emancipated the Jews. When the French left, the ghetto was restored. When Napoleon's empire collapsed, the ghetto was restored again. The final emancipation came on September 20th, 1870, when Italian troops entered Rome and absorbed the remaining Papal States into the Kingdom of Italy. On that day, after more than 300 years, the ghetto walls ceased to have legal meaning. Jews became citizens of Italy with equal rights. 315 years, from 1555 to 1870. That is how long the ghetto lasted. That is the scale of what Paul IV began, and Clement VIII intensified. The physical ghetto no longer exists. The walls were torn down. The cramped buildings were demolished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Today, the area is an attractive Roman neighborhood with restaurants, shops, and the Great Synagogue built in 1904. But traces remain. The street layout still reflects the old ghetto boundaries. The Great Synagogue stands near the site of the Cinque Scolle. The Jewish Museum of Rome, located in the synagogue complex, houses artifacts that survived the centuries of persecution, approximately 900 liturgical textiles, illuminated manuscripts, and ritual objects that the community preserved against all odds. And the archives remain. The Archivio Storico della Comunità Ebraica di Roma holds 284 linear meters of documents spanning 5 centuries. The records of the Universitas Hebreorum, the Cinque Scolle, the forced baptisms, the relations with papal authorities. All of it is there, waiting to be studied. Kenneth Stowe, the preeminent scholar of papal Jewish history, has spent his career working with these archives. He discovered that Jewish notaries in the ghetto used a specific word for their confinement. They called it seraglio, meaning enclosure. But starting in 1589, one notary began using a different term. He called it get, a word homologous with a Hebrew get, meaning a bill of divorce. Stowe interprets this as evidence of a growing consciousness of closure. By the late 16th century, Roman Jews understood that the ghetto was not a temporary measure. It was a permanent separation. They had been divorced from the world. So what does all of this mean? What can we learn from the expulsion of 1593 and the system it represented? The first lesson is about the relationship between theology and policy. Clement VIII and his predecessors believed they were acting according to divine mandate. They believed Jews were condemned by God and that Christian society had a duty to make that condemnation visible. They believed conversion was an act of mercy that would save Jewish souls from eternal damnation. These beliefs were sincerely held. They were grounded in centuries of Christian teaching. They were reinforced by the institutional structures of the Counter-Reformation Church, and they produced catastrophic harm. Sincerity does not excuse cruelty. The conviction that you are serving God does not make your actions good. The popes who created the ghetto and ordered the expulsions genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They were wrong. They caused immense suffering. And the fact that they did not intend to cause suffering does not absolve them of responsibility for it. The second lesson is about the persistence of persecution. The Roman ghetto lasted 315 years. Generations were born and died within its walls. Children grew up knowing no other reality. The abnormal became normal. The exceptional became routine. This is how persecution works. It does not require constant violence. Once the structures are in place, once the restrictions are embedded in law and custom, the system perpetuates itself. The ghetto walls did not need to be rebuilt every day. They were simply there. The conversionist sermons did not require new justifications every week. They were simply mandatory. And because the system perpetuated itself, each generation inherited it as a given. The Jews who lived in the ghetto in 1700 had never known a Rome without a ghetto. The Christians who passed the ghetto walls had never known a Rome without a ghetto. The abnormality of confining people based on their religion had become invisible through familiarity. The third lesson is about resistance. Despite everything, the Jewish community of Rome survived. Despite the pressure to convert, almost no one did. Despite the degradations, the annual humiliations, the seizure of children, why the community maintained its identity and its faith. This was not passive survival. It was active resistance. Every time a parent taught a child Hebrew, they were resisting. Every time a family observed Shabbat, they were resisting. Every time a rabbi stood before the congregation in one of the Cinque Skol and led prayers, he was resisting. The popes wanted Jews to convert or disappear. The Jews refused to do either. That refusal, sustained across centuries, was an act of defiance that the persecutors never successfully crushed. The fourth lesson is about the alternatives. The expulsion of 1593 was not inevitable. Other rulers in the same era made different choices. The Medici welcomed Jews to Livorno. The Ottoman sultans welcomed Jews to Constantinople and Salonika. The Dutch Republic would soon become a haven for Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere. The existence of these alternatives proves that persecution was a choice. Clement VIII could have maintained the tolerant policies of Sixtus V. He chose not to. He chose expulsion. He chose intensified restriction. He chose to inflict suffering that his predecessor had declined to inflict. The fact that persecution is a choice means that resistance is also a choice. Every time someone refused to participate in persecution, every time someone helped a Jewish neighbor, every time someone questioned whether the ghetto was really necessary, they were demonstrating that alternatives existed. Before we conclude, it is worth acknowledging the scholars who have made this history accessible. Kenneth Stowe has spent his career studying papal Jewish policy and the Jewish community of Rome. His books, including Catholic Thought and Papal Jury Policy, Theater of Acculturation, and the Jews in Rome, draw on extensive archival research to reconstruct the lived experience of ghetto existence. He has argued that the ghetto paradoxically strengthened Jewish identity by forcing the community to develop internal resources for survival. Robert Bonfil, in his book Jewish Life in Renaissance Italy, challenged the traditional narrative that focused exclusively on persecution. He argued that even within the constraints of the ghetto, Jews maintained vibrant cultural and religious lives. The ghetto was oppressive, but it was not culturally sterile. David Kurtzer, working with previously sealed Vatican archives, wrote The Popes Against the Jews, examining the continuity of papal anti-Jewish policy from the Counter-Reformation through the 20th century. His later book, The Pope and Mussolini, won the Pulitzer Prize for its investigation of Vatican relations with fascist Italy. Marina Cafiero has produced the definitive study of forced baptisms in Forced Baptisms, Histories of Jews, Christians, and Converts in Papal Rome. Her research has documented the devastating practice by which Jewish children were seized and converted against their will and the will of their families. Anna Foa's The Jews of Europe After the Black Death provides broader European context for the Italian experience. Ariel Toph's 3-volume documentary collection, The Jews in Umbria, contains 2,813 archival documents spanning 1245 to 1736, providing primary source access to centuries of Jewish life in central Italy. These scholars and others have preserved the memory of what was done. They have rescued from obscurity the names and stories of people who might otherwise have been forgotten. They have forced us to confront the reality of persecution, rather than letting it fade into comfortable abstraction. We began with a date, February 25, 1593, the day Clement VIII signed the expulsion decree. We end with another date, September 20th, 1870, the day Italian troops entered Rome, and the Papal States ceased to exist as an independent political entity, the day the ghetto finally ended. In between those dates lie 277 years of confinement, 277 years of yellow hats and conversionist sermons, 277 years of flooding and overcrowding and poverty, 277 years of resistance. The Jews of Rome did not simply wait for liberation. They lived their lives within the constraints imposed on them. They raised their children. They mourned their dead. They celebrated their holidays. They studied their texts. They prayed their prayers. When the walls came down in 1870, the community emerged blinking into a new world. Equal citizenship, freedom of movement, the right to live wherever they chose, to practice whatever profession they chose, to participate fully in Italian society. Many left the old neighborhood. They spread across Rome and across Italy. Some emigrated to America and other destinations. The concentration of Jews in the former ghetto area diminished, but some stayed. Some rebuilt. In 1904, the Great Synagogue of Rome was inaugurated, an enormous structure in an eclectic Assyrian-Babylonian style, deliberately designed to be visible and impressive. It stands today as a statement that the Jewish community is no longer confined, no longer hidden behind walls, no longer forced to worship in a cramped building with 5 congregations stacked on top of each other. The community that exists today is the direct descendant of the community that Clement VIII tried to eliminate. They survived the expulsion. They survived the ghetto. They survived the Nazi occupation of Rome in 1943 to 44, when more than 1,000 Roman Jews were deported to Auschwitz. They are still there. And that survival is the final answer to the question we began with. Why were Jews expelled from the Papal States in 1593? Because a pope believed it was God's will. Because hardliners in the papal court demanded it. Because economic calculations shifted. Because the ideology of the Counter-Reformation demanded clear boundaries between Christian and non-Christian. Because power, when wielded without restraint, tends toward cruelty. But the expulsion was not the end of the story. The community that was expelled from Bologna did not cease to exist. The community that was confined to the Roman ghetto did not disappear. The traditions that were attacked did not die. The bones that the Jews of Bologna carried with them when they were expelled, the bones of their ancestors that they refused to leave behind, were eventually reburied in free soil. Their descendants live today in communities around the world. The Talmud that Clement VIII ordered burned was preserved by Jewish communities in Amsterdam, in Venice, in Constantinople. It was printed and reprinted. It is studied today in academies across the globe. The synagogues of Rome, forced into a single building under Paul IV, have multiplied again. There are synagogues now throughout the city. The Great Synagogue alone can hold thousands. The history we have recounted is painful. It is a history of persecution, of cruelty, of suffering inflicted in the name of religion. It is important to remember this history precisely without evasion or excuse. But it is also a history of survival, of resistance, of a community that refused to disappear, no matter how much pressure was applied. The expulsion of 1593 revealed what religious authority can become when it is wielded without mercy. The survival of the community reveals what human beings can endure when they refuse to surrender their identity. Both lessons are worth remembering. The story of the 1593 expulsion is not ancient history. It is recent enough that the documents still exist. The archives can still be read. The names of the victims can still be recovered. The buildings where some of them lived, in those communities that survived, still stand. And the patterns it reveals are not unique to the 16th century. Religious persecution, the demonization of minorities, the conviction that one's own beliefs justify cruelty toward others. These are not relics of a distant past. They are recurring temptations of human societies. They emerged in the 16th century. They emerged in the 20th century. They emerge wherever people convince themselves that eliminating those who are different is a form of righteousness. The historian Robert Bonfil has argued that we should resist the temptation to see Jewish history solely through the lens of persecution. Jews were not merely victims, they were active participants in the cultures where they lived, contributing to commerce, scholarship, the arts, the texture of daily life. The ghetto was imposed upon them, but they created a world within its walls that was more than just suffering. This is true, and it is important. But it does not diminish the reality of the suffering. The Jews of Rome were not defined solely by persecution, but they were persecuted, systematically and deliberately, for centuries. Acknowledging their agency and their creativity does not require minimizing what was done to them. Clement VIII believed he was serving God when he signed the expulsion decree. He believed he was protecting Christian souls from Jewish contamination. He believed he was doing good. He was wrong. And the measure of his error is the suffering he caused to people whose only offense was practicing a different religion, worshiping the same God in a different way, maintaining traditions that had been handed down from parents to children for 100 generations. The measure of their response is that they survived anyway, that their children and their children's children are still here, that the tradition he sought to destroy by book burning and expulsion and forced conversion is still alive, still practiced, still transmitted from generation to generation across the globe. The community that Clement VIII tried to eliminate has outlasted the Papal States themselves. The Pope is now a spiritual leader without temporal territory. The Jews of Rome are citizens of a secular republic, free to practice their faith or not as they choose. The ghetto is a memory, preserved in archives and museums, no longer a lived reality. The Arch of Titus still stands in Rome at the eastern entrance to the Forum. For almost 2,000 years, Jews refused to walk under it. The arch commemorated the destruction of their temple and the enslavement of their ancestors. To pass beneath it would be to accept defeat, to acknowledge that Titus had won. But in 1948, after the establishment of the State of Israel, a group of Roman Jews organized a march through the arch. They walked in the opposite direction from the carved captives, not toward Rome as prisoners, but away from it as free people. They carried Israeli flags and sang Hebrew songs. It was a symbolic reversal of the ancient tragedy. And in a way, that is what this entire story is about. Not just the suffering, though the suffering was real and should never be forgotten. Not just the persecution, though the persecution was systematic and should never be minimized. But also the refusal to accept that persecution as the final word. The insistence that the story did not end with the expulsion, with the ghetto, with the book burnings, with the forced conversions, with all the machinery of cruelty that the church deployed. The popes had power. They had armies and inquisitors and the claimed authority of God himself. They had walls and gates and guards. They had law and custom and centuries of tradition on their side. The Jews had nothing except their faith, their community, their books, their prayers, and their stubborn refusal to disappear. In the end, that was enough. The Roman Jewish community persists to this day. There are approximately 13,000 Jews living in Rome, the largest Jewish population in Italy. They have their great synagogue, their museum, their schools, their institutions. They are part of the fabric of the city, as they have been for more than 2,000 years. They survived the popes. They survived the ghettos. They survived the Nazis, who deported more than 1,000 Roman Jews to Auschwitz in October 1943. They survived everything that was thrown at them, and they are still there. That persistence is the final answer to Clement VIII. He signed a document ordering their expulsion. They refused to disappear. 4 centuries later, his document is a museum piece, a historical curiosity, an artifact of a vanished world. They are still praying in synagogues, still celebrating holidays, still teaching their children, still living their lives. History does not always favor the powerful. Sometimes it favors the persistent. Sometimes those who seem weakest endure longest. Sometimes the walls come down, and what was hidden behind them emerges into the light, battered but unbroken, diminished but not destroyed. The expulsion of 1593 was meant to be a final solution to the Jewish presence in the Papal States. It was not final. It was not a solution. It was only another chapter in a very long story. And the story continues. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.